Colombia, Canada. As the Ukrainians get better at retreating, what would happen if the Russians pushed the Ukrainian forces all the way to their western borders? How would NATO react?
Well, we're going to find out. I think tomorrow Putin's giving a big speech, and something tells me that the speech might be linked to maybe the next phase in the conflict, which means the green flare is going to go up, and the Russian forces are going to start meaningful offensive operations. And then we'll find out how good the Ukrainians are at retreating. They're not very good right now because they tend to die. And I think the Russians are going to hit the accelerator and just press them. And one concept that comes to mind is collapse. So we'll see whether the Russians take it all the way to the Western Ukrainian border, or to the border between Western Ukraine and Poland and Hungary and Romania and all. I don't know. They have X number of troops. Ukraine's a big country, and they don't want to make the same mistake of spreading out too far. So we'll see what the Russians do, though. But I have a funny feeling the Russians have thought through what the next steps are, and the next steps are designed to be decisive in nature. Russia doesn't want this war to go on forever. Russia doesn't want this war to end with this cancerous, odious, infected state called Zelensky's Ukraine still intact. I think Russia's looking for a decisive end to this conflict, and NATO's going to have to accept it. The bottom line is NATO can do nothing, and it can provide weapons. I mean, wow, the British are providing 14 Challenger 2 tanks. 14, Jeff. 14. That's a lot. It's not really a lot. The Zaluzhny asked for 300, and the British gave him 14. Good job, England. But that's it. Peskov said no statement. Okay, well, now we don't. So maybe tomorrow something different. But the bottom line is at some point in time, the Russians are going to pull the trigger. And when they do, I think they're not going to keep their foot off the gas. It's just going to keep the pressure going and going and going and going. So, we'll see. But NATO, all NATO can do is continue to bankrupt itself financially and militarily by providing equipment and funding to a Ukrainian war effort that is not up to the task. As Russians would say, it's inadequate.
Odious.
Kevin Michelizzi is handling backstage duties today. Thanks for helping us out with that info, Kevin. Fu from Chicago. What do you think of the recent Center for Strategic and International Studies report that says that the Battle of Taiwan will end with a Pyrrhic victory for the U.S.-Japan coalition forces?
Let me tell you what I think of the CSIS. These are people who have corrupted themselves in their integrity by being willing to serve as mouthpiece for Western interests. How do I know? Because CSIS issued a ridiculous report in the fall of 2002 that basically said Iraq has WMD, and it justified the military action against Iraq. And right now, what's happened is every time a war game is done, the West loses. America loses. We can't beat the Chinese in a war game about Taiwan unless we really, really skew the results. I mean, we have to we have to program in artificial things like all of our airplanes work all of the time. Capabilities that aren't going to be ready for 4 years are now ready. And the Chinese, of course, are incompetent, can't execute, can't do anything. So we do all that, and it comes out as a Pyrrhic victory. No, the CSIS is not a credible think tank. It's a propaganda tool, and that's what it's being used for right now. Their job is to create the perception that it is possible for the West to win. Even if it's a Pyrrhic victory, it's possible. That defeat isn't the only outcome. So no, I don't have any respect for that organization.
Big Rich, a Russian in the UK. I've heard you say when describing the peace deal in 2014 that Russia was winning, but Putin chose peace, as if Russia was the one fighting Ukraine and Donbass back then. Could you please clarify what you mean, since OSCE, that's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in case you didn't know, Scott, didn't report any Russian forces there?
Well, we know that the Russians were firing artillery. We know that. The artillery was fired from Russian soil into Ukraine, but the Russian artillery is what destroyed 2 battalions of Ukrainian forces in one of the worst single-day setbacks ever. It's a thing that NATO woke up to, because these 2 battalions were organized as if they were NATO-like. And in a single day of Russian artillery interdiction, they became gone. So that was a wake-up call. But the battle I'm referring to is one where the Ukrainians came in. It's a village north of the big city of Donetsk, and it looked like the Ukrainians had surrounded the Donetsk militia, was getting ready to take them out, and suddenly they got hit with 2 pincers. Where did these pincers come from? I don't care what the OSCE says. The casualty reports point to at least one brigade of Russian armor, the 8th Brigade, 8th Armor Brigade, being involved, because there's tanks from the 8th Armor Brigade, and Russian soldiers are being returned home in caskets from the 8th Armor Brigade. So Russians were taking casualties in Ukraine. I don't care what the OSCE says. I'm just telling you what the facts are, which is why Putin was the decision maker. Putin had made the decision that he was committing troops to the battlefield for a decisive outcome. He was going to destroy the Ukrainian army, therefore eliminate the threat to Donbass. And that's why Minsk was so important, because Minsk stopped that battle. Now, it didn't stop that battle per se. It put a ceasefire. And then when the Ukrainians tried to withdraw, they suffered horrific casualties. Withdrawing, 3,000 guys were killed. And then Minsk 2 came into place, and that pretty much created a stalemate from 2015 until 2022. But no, I don't think there's any doubt that Russian troops were involved. Even though the Russian government hasn't formally acknowledged it, the reality is there were significant Russian troops engaged in the Donbass in 2014.
Fan from Australia, Russian in UK. I think I might have made another mistake. Fan from Australia. Do you think the U.S. government will list PMC Wagner, I believe that's Private Military Corporation, as a terrorist organization? And what could the implications be for the North African countries and U.S.-Russia relations if it does?
I mean, there's a possibility they will. There's a lot of political pressure on them to do that. But the reality is that Wagner, even though it's called a PMC, Private Military Corporation or company, is an adjunct of the Russian General Staff. And, the U.S. has to be careful here, because we used to use Blackwater a lot. We still use a lot of private military, corporations. A lot of PMCs contract with the CIA to provide capabilities, paramilitary capabilities for the CIA. The Department of Defense uses private military contracts to do training work around the world. The CIA has, as I alluded, has a paramilitary wing, the Special Activities Division or Special Activities Group. The U.S. military oftentimes sheep dips special operators over to the CIA, chops them over, so that while they're operating, they're doing so under the legal authorities of the CIA, which are different from the legal authorities of Department of Defense. We saw that, for instance, in the assault on Osama bin Laden. SEAL Team 6 was chopped over to the CIA for that operation. So if we call Wagner a terrorist organization, we're opening the door for the Russians to pass similar legislation, which put a lot of Americans at risk. So that would be one of the more foolish things that the United States could do.
Sparty Matt from the great state of Michigan. Any chance one of Scott's public talks would focus entirely on the history of Nazis in Ukraine? That's an interesting idea. I think a lot of people with blue and yellow flags in their Twitter bio don't understand that part of history and might be more willing to listen to Scott's analysis of the war if they knew that, instead of just listening to the media saying there is no Nazi problem in Ukraine.
I'm not opposed to this. The problem is this. When we speak of Bandera, who is the Stepan Bandera, who's sort of the founder of the modern ultranationalist movement And he's definitely the spiritual core for Ukrainian nationalists today. People will automatically say he had no other choice, that he had to do bad things in support of Ukrainian nationalism, that his motivations were just, but his means were harsh. And as soon as they say that, it becomes difficult now to move forward, because they've just literally accepted as something not to be condemned. Mass murder, the murder of Jews, tens of thousands, 110,000 Poles in the Volyn campaign, 200,000 Russians in a decade of fighting from 1944 until 1953. And how do you begin to break that down? So then you again talk about, how they worked with the Nazis and cooperated with the Nazis, and they say, yes, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and their real enemy was the Soviet Union. Stalin was the real enemy. They just do all this deflection. So I don't think that there's a lot of ignorance. I mean, yes, in America, a lot of ignorance, and a lot of people wearing the little, what do they call that? Virtue signaling, look at me, I've got my Ukrainian flag on, I'm a good person. Yes, they don't know the truth, but the hardcore people, no, I've already had conversations with them and some people that I respect, and their whole thing is, Bandera, brought to life Ukrainian nationalism during very difficult times, and that if you're going to take on Adolf Hitler and Stalin at the same time, you have to, it's going to be a tough thing. It's a tough fight. Casualties were made. And so they've excused away, his link with Nazi Germany, his anti-Semitism, and the fact that he has said in order to get the Ukrainian nation, millions of people might have to be killed in the process.
Okay. Yes, no question. Getting back to what the guy was asking, is the topic interesting and important enough to warrant an entire talk about it? And is there enough to say to fill up an entire talk?
The way I would suggest we approach this is on one of our lightning rounds, we make it exclusively questions about Ukraine's Nazi past and the links to Nazi and things like that. And so the only questions we'll entertain is that, and then we'll give it an hour. It'll be an hour-long conversation.
Okay. JD, from the great state of Connecticut, where I am currently working on some events, and hopefully we'll get that confirmed before too long. How could an accidental and or intentional nuclear exchange be kicked off? What would have to happen and or how would it happen?
Well, I believe, first of all, the initiator would be from the United States, not Russia. Russia isn't going to initiate a nuclear strike. I think that the big thing would be a NATO intervention that prompted a serious Russian conventional response, one that did strike NATO countries. Because I think Russia has made it clear that if NATO intervenes in Ukraine, that all NATO becomes a target. And I think Russia would use conventional weapons to take out some very critical leadership nodes, decision-making nodes, et cetera, maybe including NATO headquarters, Ramstein Air Base, where they have a big, it's where they do a lot of coordination with the Ukrainians, and some Polish air bases and things where they receive logistics. And they do that in a manner that just humiliates NATO to the point that NATO feels, and the United States feels necessary to send a signal to escalate, to de-escalate. We keep accusing the Russians of having that theory, but it's purely 100% ours. And we fire off a limited nuclear strike to send a signal to the Russians, enough is enough. And the problem is Russia has said they won't be the first to use nuclear weapons, but they won't be the second, meaning they're not going to wait for that to hit. Prior to that hitting, they will launch an all-out retaliation and the world ends. So that's how I think a scenario like that unfolds.
All right, that could ruin my whole weekend. I am Spartacus from Mousy, Kentucky. Let me get this shot in here. There's something weird about this. I am Spartacus from Mousy, Kentucky. Your recent comments at Ask My Favorite Weapons Inspector, suggesting all those who question the official 9/11 narrative are cockeyed conspiracy theorists, is a foul and odious ideology. You too, Jeff. This is why I avoid riding on double-decker buses, because there's no driver on the top. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm pretty sure it's an insult. But I'm happy that he called it Ask My Favorite Weapons Inspector and also used the word odious.
Odious.
And that's all I'm going to say about that. Next question.
Okay. Might be the best way to handle those people, actually. James from South Africa, is there any scenario where China would feel compelled to step in militarily, boots on the ground and hardware, to assist Russia? Given if Russia falls, China would be fighting Western advances alone.
No, there's no scenario. China is not going to send Chinese troops into Ukraine. Russia would never accept Chinese troops in Ukraine. Logistically, it's a nightmare. No military commander would ever propose this. China's never prepared for this kind of conflict. It's against Chinese operational doctrine. I don't think there's any legal foundation in this for China. Just no. Russia's going to win. I mean, remember, right? Russia mobilized 300,000 troops. If this fails, and I don't think it will, but if it fails, there's 22.7 million other reservists out there. So Russia's got a long way to go before they need China, and they don't want China to come in military, and China doesn't want to get involved militarily. Remember, China's focused on Taiwan, and it isn't just going to be Taiwan. Then if China has a war with Taiwan, China has to worry about all of the Pacific. So the last thing China's going to do is divert significant resources to Ukraine, and in the process, generate massive global outrage. One of the key aspects for China is how to emerge from any potential conflict in Taiwan with their global reputation intact. China's not going to have too much of an intact reputation globally for intervening in Ukraine. Plus, China's doing everything they can right now to keep Russia afloat. I mean, they're buying the energy. They're working with the Indians to buy energy. Russia had a 28% profit increase in profits for a nation that's supposed to be so heavily sanctioned. When their books grow by 28%, they ain't shrinking. They ain't dying. So that's what China's doing. China's providing the leadership for the non-aligned world to continue to do business with Russia. That's where China's most valuable. The last thing either China or Russia would ever want or need is Chinese troops, boots on the ground in Ukraine. It would just be a disaster.
All right, let's do one more question submitted in advance, and then let's squeeze in some live questions from the folks on YouTube and Facebook. Aiden, Normandy, France. Who are the masters of war in Russia? How does it work? Who do they obey? Are they private, public? Where does the money come from, and who earns the dividends? That's an interesting question.
I think he's pretty much talking, I hope I'm getting this right, his equivalent of the military-industrial complex.
I think that's the way I took it.
Yeah. Look, Russia has an advanced defense industry. But the defense industry, even though they're joint stock corporations, the joint is the Russian government. So the defense industry doesn't exist to turn an exorbitant or obscene profit. The defense industry exists to serve the Russian nation. And that's the biggest difference right there. And so the defense industry responds to the needs, wants, and desires of the Russian government. To the extent that I guess you could say who are the masters of war. Like anything, defense industry contributes to the economy, the local economy. So I would imagine that governors of districts that have significant defense industry establishments in place, they have a system geared, for instance, to train the proper engineers. So there's a pipeline between institutions that train engineers and the defense industries themselves. We can't pretend that there isn't a complex, but they don't have the same influence and role it's just different. The Russians have done a good job of inheriting the Soviet system of, factory directors and who work as part of design teams who have interests in who have backing into the defense industry and the defense industry board. It's a similar situation today. But I think the big difference is with the Russians is that it's more about political power or professional power, professional prestige, professional status than it is about making billions of dollars. I think in America, the portfolio of the Raytheon CEO is far more important to him than the status of being Raytheon CEO. Whereas I think in Vodkinsk, the director of the Vodkinsk factory is known around town as sort of a big man in town. That's a good guy. The CEO of Raytheon doesn't walk around, whatever city he's in and have everybody bow down to him. The director of the Vodkinsk factory walks around Vodkinsk and everybody's tipping their hat because they know who controls the primary means of income generation in the area. Now, I haven't been to Vodkinsk for a long time, and I understand that there's other industries there. It's a modern city with things, but I still would imagine that the Vodkinsk Production Association holds sway over Vodkinsk.
Okay, and you can read about that in Scott's book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. And I can never say that title without pointing out that it rolls right off the tongue. All right, let's take some questions from our beloved audience live. What do you got, Kevin? Thanks to Kevin Michelizzi for doing a great job as usual backstage.
Oh, we have got a bunch today.
How about one?
How about one to start with?
How will NATO react when the world sees their tanks are not invincible?
The $1 million question. Germany's made a lot of money selling Leopard 2 tanks. If you take a look at a map of NATO countries and around, Leopard 2 is in a lot of arsenals. And I'm here to tell you right now, the Leopard 2 will be a death trap on the battlefield. It's just not going to be what Germany thinks it's going to be or what the Ukrainians think it's going to be. It's going to die. That's going to be sort of humiliating for the Germans. The Challenger 2, it's a decent tank, but 14 of them, it's a company. And what happens when a company meets a battalion? They're all going to die. They're not supported by artillery. They're just going to be open, they're vulnerable to everything. A tank is a weapon. A tank works best as a part of a system. Combined arms support, artillery support, close air support, infantry to protect them. You bring then the Challenger 2 tank into this environment, it's going to die. It's just going to be yet another humiliation for NATO, just like the Patriot air defense system is going to turn out to be a humiliation for NATO. There's not enough of them. They're not that good. These aren't game-changing technologies. The Challenger's been around for a long time. So it's not like the Russians don't know about it. It's not like the Russians never said, well, what if the British sent a brigade and we had to fight a British brigade in the plains of Poland? What are we going to get to destroy the Challenger? And it's not like the Russian defense industry never said, hey, why don't we try this round? It's actually perfect for the Chobham armor on the Challenger. I bet you the Russians have anti-tank rounds designed to kill the Chobham tank armor. And I bet you when those 14 Chobham armored Challenger 2 vehicles show up on the battlefield, that the Russians will have the appropriate response for them, which will result in the Chobham armor being pierced like a hot knife or hot butter with a hot knife. There you go. Get the analogy straight before you speak it, and blow up. So it's just going to be bad for NATO all around. It's going to show NATO the reality of the fact that for the last 20 years, they've been singularly focused on fighting farmers and villagers in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they forgot, that there's a real army out there called Russians, and the Russians haven't. The Russians have been training and equipping to fight a NATO-type army since at least 2008.
Okay. Rajab Abasov, thanks for the tip. Do you think even after Russia wins, will the West admit it caused the war and build Ukraine's economy, or will they stick to its lies like how the West always does?
This is it's an unknowable. I think the bottom line is that Europe, because I think what's going to happen after Russia wins, because I do believe Russia is going to win, that the West is going to become very fractured, and that we're going to have three schools develop. One will be the American school, which is, of course, we are the exceptional superpower. It's not our fault they lost. The Ukrainians can't fight. Europe sucks, all that, but it's not our fault.
Ignore that.
Europe. Pardon?
Sorry, ignore that. Go ahead.
Oh, then Europe is going to fracture at least into two schools of thought. One is we need to double down on NATO and get more American support in Europe. And the other one's going to be, screw that. That didn't work. America set us up for failure, and we need to start promoting an exclusive European security framework where Europe looks out for Europe's best interests. And I think Russia's going to want to talk to the latter, to talk to the ones who look out for European interests and come up with a new European security framework that deals. The interesting thing is I think this division is going to be old Europe, the old NATO countries moving away from the United States, and the new Europe, the Baltic countries and Poland, maybe the Czech Republic, being the ones that want heavy commitment. And we might see something where the United States, either with or without NATO, doubles down in providing support for these new countries in some sort of treaty relationship. But I think we're going to see a divide, a fracture in Europe. And I think we're going to see the United States become increasingly isolated from Europe, because there's a lot of resentment right now, not just about the military quagmire. That'll become more evident when Russia wins. But the economy, you got the Germans and the French very mad at the United States about how they've caused them to divorce from Russian gas, but charge them, horrific prices for American liquid natural gas. And industries are shutting down, jobs are fleeing, and the Germans and the French are waking up to the fact that America is not their friend.
Okay, we're at the 1 hour mark now, but since we were a little chattier than usual at the beginning, do you want to a little loquacious, more so than usual? Do you want to go a few more minutes, give them a few more live questions? You got the time?
Absolutely.
All right. Andres Groudens, thank you, Andres. I'd like to know Scott's opinion regarding the World Economic Forum's role for RU. What's RU?
Russia.
Oh, okay. As some of their ideas are implemented in Russia, and yet the Russian leaders are against them.
Look, there's a divorce right now. The World Economic Forum Russia doesn't care. I mean, a year ago or 2 years ago, Russia was making an effort to work within the World Economic Forum's, ideal or intellectual, framework to come up with a way to cooperate with the West. Russia's divorced from the West. It's over. Putin just divorced from Europe totally. He's not obeying. He's broken with the European Council. He's broken with the European Union. It's over. The World Economic Forum can meet in Davos and they can talk all they want. Russia ain't listening. Russia doesn't care. As I've always said, the honey badger don't give a damn. And Russia is the honey badger, and they just don't care anymore about the West. The West blew it. And so you have a bunch of pompous, hot air filled balloons sitting there spewing hot gas. Russia's not listening. Russia's coming up with a new reality, a new way of doing business. So the World Economic Forum is literally irrelevant when it comes to Russia.
Okay, moving on to our next question. Merdad. Scott, can you please talk about the situation in Yemen? I love to hear your opinion. Much love from Iran. Much love right back at you, and thanks for the tip.
I could speak intelligently about Yemen up to mid-December, I think. But after that, I'm just going to be honest. It's been off my radar, and I know, hit me with lightning, all you want, whip me. Yemen should never be off anybody's radar because of the humanitarian disaster that's taking place there. I've just been singularly focused on Ukraine since that point, and I apologize for that because it is a serious issue, one that I have focused on and written about. When the last I looked at Yemen, there was a ceasefire agreement was collapsing, primarily because of the lack of integrity shown by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others regarding the lifting of sanctions, the supplying of food, etc. And the Houthis, were likewise not willing to shut down totally their stranglehold they had on gosh, it begins with an M. There's a city they had surrounded and all that. Yeah, I don't know how the fighting has progressed. I haven't seen it in the headlines, so I don't think Yemen, either side, has scored a major victory. I think it's more of the same. I don't know if that ceasefire is renewed. I have to be honest. I have to go back and look up on it. But I will say this: the Yemen conflict is, it's a stain on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab states who aligned with Saudi Arabia. The Houthis have fought heroically and successfully. The Yemeni people have paid a horrific price and will continue to pay a horrific price for some time to come. There's some of the worst famine related incidents, the disease that comes with that have accrued from this. The children are paying a price that shouldn't be paid. And it's also gotten caught up in regional geopolitics. I think one of the difficulties in resolving the Yemen situation is that from the Western perspective, Yemen has aligned itself with Iran, has become part of the axis of resistance that Iran has created to stand up against, American hegemony in the Middle East and the role played by America's allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others, to try and suppress Iran's concerns. So Yemen's caught in the middle of this struggle, and it's just an absolute tragedy. But I will endeavor to catch up, and maybe I'll write something about it. So that's my way of saying I'm sorry. I wish I had been in a better place to answer that question.
Okay, those of you watching on Twitch, Twitter, and Rumble, please understand that we cannot see your comments that are coming in live. So it's only on Facebook and YouTube that we can see the comments and questions live. What else you have, Kevin? Rowdy Every Point. Thank you so much, Rowdy. Great name. What are the chances, if Russia total victory over Ukraine, that Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, or Moldova assimilate conquered Ukrainian territory?
This is the big $1 million question. I don't think Poland's going to be allowed to do it at all. Belarus has said, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has said that the one way to guarantee that Belarus sends troops into Ukraine is if Poland makes a move on Western Ukraine. Belarus isn't going to allow the Poles to extend their border, which is a hostile border, and wrap it around, Belarus's, southern districts. It just isn't going to be permitted. So I don't know what Poland thinks is going to happen, but I think Belarus and the Russians have made it clear what they are going to do, which is destroy any Polish effort to do that. They won't be allowed to occur. If Hungary seeks to reincorporate I think there's 200,000 Hungarian-speaking Ukrainians who, by the way, if you want to help promote Russia or Ukraine or Hungarian intervention, do what the Ukrainians are doing, sending the right sector there, threatening to hang and burn and rape and murder anybody who talks about, Hungarian autonomy. The same thing with the Romanians, Moldovans, etc. And here's the other problem. The Europeans have, the West, collective West has, at the end of World War II, one of the great aspects, concepts they bought into is that the borders are not to be violated, that the borders are permanent, that the day and age of countries invading other countries and redrawing borders is over. Well, then the West blew it with Kosovo because they pretty much got Serbia they stripped away Kosovo and then they declared it to be independent and all that. And now Russia's moved into Ukraine and taken away 5 territories. Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea, and they're probably going to take away more. Now Europe can legitimize all this by saying, well, then Ukraine's free game. Go in, boys, cut it up, just do it any way you want. One, I don't know how Russia's going to respond to that. We know that Poland won't be allowed to do it, but is Hungary going to do it or others going to do it? Don't know. But that would be the end, because once that happens, every border becomes temporary in nature. What happens if the Germans decide they want to take Alsace-Lorraine again? They say, it used to belong to us, we'll take it. What if they look over to Poland and say, yeah, Silesia is looking pretty good too. We're going to take that too. What happens when, Serbia takes a look at Croatia and says, all those areas that you kicked Serbians out of, we're coming back there. it's a free-for-all at that point in time, and Europe has struggled hard to prevent that kind of mindset from, gaining access and influence in the minds of European leaders. So I think it's not going to be as easy politically for people to even execute that. I know the polls are full of some crazy nationalists that's taking over, but I would imagine the European Union and European Commission and NATO would try and put the brakes on that, because that would put them in a trajectory they don't want to go. Because once you start covering up the map of Europe, it's over, baby. They're all going to be fighting each other.
All right, that's it for this week's edition of Ask the Inspector, the lightning round. Our format is to do 1 hour maximum, with Scott answering all questions in 3 minutes or less. Since we were a little bit chatty in the opening, and our opening was longer than usual, we extended it by about 10 minutes. I'd like to remind folks that Scott's new article can be read. We are not behind a paywall. But if you want to sign up for a paid subscription, we certainly appreciate your support. Trust but verify at scottritterextra.com. And my tweet designed to rattle Elon Musk's cage is embedded in that article. So there's a link to that, asking everybody who reads the article or anybody who hears about it to please make some noise and try to get Scott back on Twitter, or at the very least an explanation as to what the hell is going on. Sunday is our other podcast, Scenes from the Evolution. Kevin Michelizzi, Tori Mansfield, and myself are the co-hosts. Thanks to Kevin, who handled the backstage duties so ably today. And the loquacious version of Ask the Inspector will be Friday night, as per usual, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Kevin.
And I would just like to mention that the people who gave us tips with questions, we will make sure Scott gets those questions on Friday or Thursday.
Okay. Friday. Okay. And you mentioned that you've got some enthusiasm, Kevin, in terms of Scott's plan to go to Russia, and some folks who might be able to help, right?
I do have contacts. So you have an American living in Russia who has people who can help, Scott. So ask for anything you need, and I'll find somebody.
Okay, so the inspector is going to be asking, how do we do this? This is Ask the Inspector.
But the squeaky leaker.
We'll come up with something. Thank you.